Should you try fixing this yourself? Or is it just too risky? Most pros will tell you no, but here's the real story. Fixing a squeaky floor can be anything from a very simple task to a little bit more complicated project, and it kind of just depends where the squeak is happening. Most squeaks in floors are caused because there's a little bit of a gap between the floor joist that supports your floor and your subfloor, and then the subfloor itself. Usually that gap exists because the joist itself is not perfectly straight, or oftentimes because where two joists come together or where a joist comes into a beam, it's not perfectly straight, and so you end up with a little bit of a gap. That gap leaves room for that subfloor to flex up and down a little bit. So as you step in that spot, rubbing takes place between the floorboards and nails or screws, or between pieces of wood. That squeak oftentimes gets worse and better depending on the season, and that's because as temperatures shift around and as humidity changes from one season to the next, it'll cause wood to expand and contract. And so that gap and the movement, the flex that's allowed, that changes over time. Squeaks are really, really common, especially in older houses, as well as in less expensively made houses that many of us live in today. So what do we do about it? Well, there are some really straightforward ways that you can DIY fix this. There are literally screws that are designed to break off just below the top of the subfloor so that you can literally screw in through carpet or even through hardwood and then have it break off below the surface of the floor. And then if it's hardwood, you could just fill it in with a little wood filler, or if it's carpet, it'll be beneath the carpet and the pad. And that screw essentially is helping to either tighten it up so that you don't have that gap, or at least create a little bit more structure there. But if that gap's big enough, putting a bunch of screws in like that isn't gonna be enough. I had that experience myself in a house I lived in before this one. And in that home, we were actually replacing the carpet. So I took an opportunity while the carpet was out to put a bunch of screws in through the subfloor into the floor joists to tighten up that area. It reduced the squeak, but still in the summertime, there's a bit of a squeak and it's getting worse again. The better fix that tends to be more permanent is something you can do, but only if you have access to the underside of the floor. If you have access to that, then we can actually fill that space in. And of course, that's gonna be the best way to go, because then even with some expansion and contraction, you don't have a gap, so you don't have any movement. The best way to do that is typically with some shims. Also, you can use liquid nails. They have a subfloor, essentially glue, that you can use to kind of fill in that space. Ideally, the builder will use some of that subfloor glue on the floor joists, then lay down the subfloor and then screw it in. And what that's gonna do is help prevent any gaps from taking place, even if the floor joists aren't perfectly flat and even if the joints aren't perfectly abutted. So what's the deal? Why are so many people saying not to fix this yourself? The main reason is that when you start screwing a bunch of screws into the floor, you don't really know what you might run into. Comments on other videos talk about how this is a dumb thing to do because one, if you don't know exactly where the floor joists are, you're just gonna be having a bit of trial and error, screwing into the floor all over the place, looking for where the floor joists might be. And if you're just screwing screws in everywhere, and even if you are hitting the floor joist, there's always a chance you could hit a water pipe, a drain line, or a wire, and then you could electrocute yourself and cause all sorts of problems. Other reasons a lot of the pros will say not to do this yourself is one, the fixes, they don't always last. I think that's kind of a poor justification to tell you not to do it yourself. Their fixes might not last either. But the other one is that if you do it wrong, you could potentially make it worse. I'm not entirely sure how, other than if you start putting shims in the wrong places, but then you just adjust where the shims are until there's no more squeak. It's not that big of a deal. I think the biggest issue is if you just start drilling a bunch of holes into the ground, you could run into something and you could end up not even ever making it any better. So it's a risk without any real reward. So here are my thoughts on that big concern. The first one is, if you just use a stud finder, you're gonna be able to figure out where the floor joist is without having to do a bunch of experimenting. Now, a really cheap stud finder might not be able to get through a layer of carpet, or even through, like, if you have hardwood and then a subfloor, it might get mixed up and not understand like where the actual joist is. But if you just get a stud finder that has kind of a deep measurement, which isn't that expensive, you're going to be able to find that floor joist without any trouble. So then we can eliminate the need for the trial and error and reduce the risk of hitting a water pipe or an electrical cable. But water pipes and electrical cables often do run alongside floor joists and even go through them. We drill holes through them so that we can get power and water from one side to the other. Now here's my problem with that argument. Do you ever screw things into your wall? Do you look for a stud before screwing something into the wall? You do, right? I do. When I'm hanging stuff up and I want it to be able to be in a stud, not just in the drywall, I look for a stud and then I screw things into it. Well, you got a lot of electrical cables running through the walls. In a lot of cases, even more than you're gonna find in the floor. And yet, do we tell people don't screw things into the wall? No, of course not. We don't put water lines and we don't put electrical cables right up to the surface, right, like if it's in the floor, we tend to run it through about the middle of the floor joist, not the top of the floor joist. In a wall, we kind of run it through the middle when we have to go through a stud. Secondly, at least in a stud in the wall, you're supposed to put on nail plates, which is a metal plate that we put on the stud that prevents people from screwing in right where the electrical cables or where the water lines pass through. Now, we don't use nail plates on the top of floor joists because the floor joists and the floors are in place usually before we run water lines and electrical cables. But when you got a floor joist that's that wide running along there and we run electrical cables through and we run them in the middle, you're not gonna hit it with a screw. I think that's kind of a ridiculous argument. I think you're perfectly safe to go ahead and try the screw method. My bigger concern is that the screw method is the least likely to work. It's just the only one available to us if we don't really have access to the underside of the floor. So when does it make sense to do it yourself? It makes sense absolutely if you have access to the underside, because then you can see what's there and you can see if you're gonna drill into anything, but also because you can put shims in wherever the gap is. And that's gonna do a much better job than screwing alone anyway. You can also do it yourself if it's in a part of your home where you're confident you're not gonna run into a water line or an electrical cable. I get it, even with the caveats I gave before, there's still a bit of a risk, but not if it's a part of your home where it's obvious that there's not gonna be any water lines or power cables, which is a lot of the floor. When should you not do it yourself? Well, if you're not very confident in your DIY skills and you're going through like even hardwood floor, it's gonna put a little hole there. You can fill it very nicely, but if you are afraid that you're gonna mess that up and make it look ugly, then I probably wouldn't do it yourself. Also, I probably wouldn't do it under tile or laminate flooring because that's gonna be a lot harder to hide it. But through carpet especially, it's pretty easy to do yourself. Also, maybe don't do it yourself if you're not sure what's under the floor. You can use a stud finder that can sense electrical wires, and that's gonna help avoid most of the common issues that you're gonna run into. Again, water lines run through a very small percentage of your house, but electrical cables, they're pretty well going everywhere. And so if you have a stud finder that can find those, great, we can avoid that easy. But if you don't, and you don't wanna go get one, then I also probably wouldn't do this yourself. So here's the short of it. DIYers can absolutely work on fixing their squeaky floors themselves. I think most of the arguments telling you not to do it are overly cautious, and there's a lot of people online that are overly cautious in the comments they leave on other people's videos and in social media forums. But if you have big concerns, then you might call in a professional to look at it and evaluate it for you and see what it's gonna take. And I 100% think that if you're a DIYer at all, you can absolutely troubleshoot this and probably fix it yourself if you have underside access to that floor because it's an open basement or a crawl space. But if you don't have that access and you're at all worried and you think that there's electrical lines or water lines running through there, then maybe call a professional. They might be able to evaluate also those risks. They might have access to tools you don't, like a stud finder that can sense more deeply and that can sense other things besides studs like electrical cables and maybe even water lines. So you need to decide if that risk is worth it for you. For me, I feel pretty confident doing it myself. But if you're gonna do this project, I have a couple pieces of advice for you. One, use a stud finder, or maybe even drill a little hole right through the floor and use a little bore camera. I got one on Amazon for like 20 bucks that just plugs into your phone. It's got a little light on it that allows me to look behind walls and things without having to completely tear things open. And two, try the simplest fixes first. Again, if you have access to the other side, use shims. Use a little bit of maybe lubricant, especially if it's like hardwood floor and there's a little bit of spacing there. You can use a little bit of floor lubricant, like a graphite lubricant, that will help just with the squeaking. So it's not gonna stop the rubbing from happening, but it's gonna prevent it from squeaking when it does happen. So now here's my question for you. Is this a project that you feel comfortable trying? Are there risks that I didn't consider that you're aware of? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like straight to the point DIY advice and breakdowns like this, you might wanna subscribe to Fixter because that is one of the things we do here. Thanks for joining me today. We'll see you all next time here on Fixter.